Welcome to the Still Life podcast, a series of 21 topics, with each episode exploring the practical nature of the spiritual experience, with time-tested insights from psychotherapy, evolutionary biology, and meditation from ex-animator and stillness coach, Jim.
Because I view Jim George as a trainer for the soul. There's no better animation artist, drawer than Jim.
He is a friend, he is a mentor, incredible advisor. There's no one who's more important to me in my life.
The most interesting, most intelligent person I've ever met.
He truly is somebody who wants nothing from you and everything for you.
My name is Henry, and I'm a former client of Jim's, and the work we've done together over the past 8 years has changed my life. We're now on a mission to share these insights with you, and to draw some pretty interesting conclusions on how to live a still life.
Hello, Henry. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm always better for having seen you, and I am the luckiest guy on earth. That will never change.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd say that.
Yeah, it's true.
I'm surprised you feel like the luckiest guy on earth because this morning I'm about to ask you some pretty damn difficult questions.
Yeah, this is getting more and more brutal each time.
Yeah. And I don't know if that would be considered luck in many people's eyes. Maybe not even in your own.
Well, there's two kinds, you know.
So Jim, we are talking about reality today.
Whoa.
Yeah. And it's going to be a tough one to get our, well, at least for me, it's going to be a tough one to get my mind around.
Oh,
I reckon.
Me too.
So I think before I try and preempt anything and waffle along, could you please define reality for us?
Wow. There's the question, isn't it? So that question is so broad, is so vast, that the best that we're going to be able to do is kind of point in the right direction, like a monkey pointing to a laptop, because reality is that big. You're asking me to define the undefinable. You're asking me to make the infinite finite. So, given that, let's just try and find a place to put our feet and start. Let's start with the symbol that we use to represent that reality. Let's look at that word. Okay? It comes from the Latin res, R-E-S. Thing. Thingness. As opposed to no thingness. Nothingness. What is? What exists?
It's not very helpful.
I mean, it isn't, is it?
I feel like we haven't gone
So we haven't. So let's take that enormous, that infinite bucket, and let's try to break it down into some smaller buckets. So I like to think of reality in kind of two senses. Number one, what I call relative reality. Okay? That is reality relative to whomever or whatever is perceiving it, and relative to the scale that it's being perceived from. Okay? So we're talking about any number of relative realities within this bigger bucket of what is, what exists.
And when you say perceiving it and at what scale, I'm assuming that you're about to go into this.
Well, yeah. If you want me to go into it now, I can, but I like to try to get through it before it gets too opaque.
Okay.
So we can go into that. Then there's the other bucket, which is what is known as objective reality, or what I think of as universal reality. That is reality that is there, whether someone or something is perceiving it or not. It's what's there regardless of what scale we're talking about. Okay, does that make sense? The idea that there is something there, something, whether we're perceiving it or not. Okay? Now, if that kind of helps us to get a little bit of a fence around this thing, then I'll just throw it back at you. And
Yeah, so what I'm getting from this is that you like to think of it in two ways. One of it is from more of a subjective perspective. One of it's from more of a something viewing reality in terms of something's perceiving it.
Yes.
And it's, I think when you say a different scale, it's potentially, at the scale of our consciousness, but there could be other scales to it.
sure, depending on who or what is observing it.
Gotcha. And
Yeah.
then the other aspect to this is just the actual oneness, the unity of reality that's outside of us.
Whatever it is, yeah.
Okay. Can you just expand on why are those two things different? Why is there, something where I'm relatively subjectively observing reality, and then you made the distinction of like an objective reality that's just out there.
Yeah.
Can only make the assumption that we don't perceive the object of reality.
If it is independent of observation, how can we know what, if anything, is there? We're perceiving what we're perceiving. That's different from what is objectively there. And we can go into that because this is where things get interesting. But I want to make sure that that part is clear because we're building a foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to lay the foundation, for me, when even thinking about reality, to understand that what I'm perceiving isn't necessarily all that is there, or isn't necessarily a good representation of what is
by
there.
definition.
Do you mind just expanding on that a little bit more? Because, that to me was a big aha moment. Because one of the aspects of being human is I wake up into this sort of meat suit and I just accept my given reality. I just accept that this is what there is.
Yeah, notice how you framed that. My given reality. That's what I mean by relative reality. Relative to what it is you're perceiving. We tend to take that to the extreme and say, that's the way things are. Obviously, I'm looking at it. How about Phil over there? How about that iguana in the tree? I'm not sure they're perceiving the same reality.
Got you. So this is why you made that distinction, because there is one thing to be perceived.
Yes.
However, it depends on what equipment you have to really perceive it.
Brilliant.
And I think that something that's quite interesting just to dig into here is that I assume that your view of reality is the same as my view of reality.
Yeah, don't.
It can't be, because you're not the same
That's right.
viewer. You're not the
That's
same
right.
observer.
But we tend to make these assumptions. And we don't question them because, well, it's obvious. There it is. Can't you see it? And the answer is no, not the way you do. So,
Okay, so what have we evolved to perceive? I like to tend to take these podcasts for like, what is it that we're talking about?
Yeah.
And then how did we come to talk about them?
Good.
So just as humans, if we just look at our more recent history in terms of the past 100,000 years,
Yeah.
how is it that we came to perceive this oneness? And do you think there are any limitations to the way that we do perceive it? I always do this. I hit two questions.
fire two or more.
Yeah, and make it.
So, first of all, I'm glad you raised it the way you did, because any discussion that you and I have about reality, if it's going to be a practical, useful discussion, we're going to have to leave a lot out, aren't we? In fact, statistically speaking, I'd like to suggest we have to leave almost everything out compared to what it is we can discuss. In terms of our time limitation, the scope of a podcast, our capacity to understand and communicate. That's editing almost everything about reality out. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So, given that, let's take a moment and let's consider how and why we perceive it all. Because this is another one of those assumptive things that we do. We do it and we don't notice it, but let's notice it. I'd like to suggest that when we perceive anything, our senses have evolved to detect disturbances, perturbations in our immediate environment. That's what they do. And all of our senses work slightly differently, different modalities, but what they're doing is they're picking up disturbances in our immediate environment. So let's pick the sensory modality that most of our neurology is spent focused on, our vision. So when we perceive something with our eyes, okay, we're detecting disturbances in what we call the electromagnetic field or spectrum. It's this huge, vast spectrum of undulation, frequencies, and we're perceiving with our eyes a tiny little band of that entire frequency. We call that visible light. That's what we call it. Okay? When we detect that, either directly from a source or indirectly because that light, that electromagnetic energy has bounced off of something that's out there and comes in through our eyes, it hits the back of our eyeball, the retina, excites these neuroreceptors, these photosensitive receptors, and it causes those nerves to change their state. They go from being potential, they're ready, but they're inactive, to suddenly being triggered and active. That means they're sending a signal, a bit of information. Yes, 1 as opposed to 0. That signal travels down the optic nerve to an area of the brain we call the visual cortex in the back of the brain. Here's where the interesting stuff starts to happen. That part of the brain creates, let me say it again, that part of the brain creates what we call an internal representation of what's going on out there, that disturbance. Okay? Then, remember, that internal representation isn't out there. It exists only in our brain. Then, in what can only be called an act of neurological sleight of hand, that same brain, unbeknownst to us, we're not aware of it, takes that internal representation, flips it, and projects it back out onto whatever it is that's out there, and we call that reality.
Okay. Going to take a time out.
Okay.
Because that's, it's really bloody cool what you're saying. So if I were just to repeat that back to you, as you were talking, you were using a lot of body movement, right? Mm-hmm. To help, I think, really articulate the points that you were making. Like even as I'm doing this now,
yes,
where the body language is actually helping to communicate to you, because in your visual cortex, you're basically looking at the edges of what's going on and you're noticing any discrepancy. When I say discrepancy, I'm moving my hand, right? And as I'm moving my hand, that's changing. You're picking up on that change.
Yes.
That aspect of actually picking up on that change is alerting your attention to it, and you're ascribing meaning to what's happening, right? Mm-hmm. Because as you were talking about perturbations in a field, you're going like this, and you're just sort of undulating your fingers while moving your hand back and forth.
Yes.
And I'm getting more of a visual to this to accompany the sound.
Yes.
And so I'm saying all of this because as you're talking, I'm trying to think about all of the differences in my visual field that are then being transcribed within my mind. And the weird part, the thing that really, the reason I called the time out is because as soon as you said that there's this sleight of hand and this projection, I realized that I spend so much of my time, and this was an instantaneous thought that's taken me way too long to articulate, but I spend so much of my time just in my visual field that I think that that's just the world.
Yes.
But as you said, that sleight of hand is like, no, I'm actually perceiving what my mind is putting up there.
Yes.
Right? I'm not actually seeing
Say that again,
what's out there.
just so they can hear it.
I'm seeing what my mind is putting out there.
You're seeing the internal representation, not what's out there.
And just breaking down the words, internal, in my mind, representation.
Yes, good for you.
It's a presentation of the information that my mind's picking up.
Yes.
And so if we take this back to how you are defining reality, it makes a lot more sense as to why there's a relative reality. Because if I was blind, that wouldn't happen.
Right.
And so I wouldn't have that projection that's occurring. And so my reality, my subjective reality, what it means to be me, of course it's fundamentally different. And of course I'm not actually seeing well, if I'm blind, I'm not seeing at all. But
but this is where it gets interesting, because your visual cortex is busy doing what it does. It's using different inputs, and it's creating a different internal representation. It's amazing what happens when you take somebody who's been blind from birth and give them like a retinal surgical intervention, and you allow them to see for the first time. Most people in that situation say, I hate this. This is meaningless. I just stop. This is torture.
Yeah.
And we're thinking, well, yeah, but don't you want to see? They've got a completely different relative reality, and they've adapted to getting along in the world.
I mean, you look at babies when they're first born, and they've got this neurological bloom, and they're actually cutting down all of these connections.
Throwing stuff away.
So they get just what's useful.
Yes.
And, you see it looking around because they're bloody babies, right?
Yeah.
However, if you were to give me all of the inputs to the stock market and fire that into my visual cortex, of course it would be overwhelming because I would have no way to create any meaning from that information.
And look how tiny that little bit of information is relative to reality, objective reality. And you're overwhelmed. There's your point.
Overwhelmed. Okay, this is really cool. So all of this is really being constructed in our minds.
Yes.
And I'm conscious that I cut you off earlier. Was there a follow-up that you wanted to continue on that?
Well, I'm just suggesting that once we know how our senses work, then we get to this part of our conversation that's so important. And that part of our conversation comes in the form of a question. How much reality do we need to be aware of in order to do what we need to do? There's three aspects to that question. How much reality do we need to be aware of in order to do what we need to do? Too little awareness of reality, we can't survive. Too much awareness of this reality, and we're utterly and completely overwhelmed, and we can't survive. So we've got this sweet spot, this little Goldilocks sweet spot, just the right amount of reality so that we can do what we need to do, which begs the question, what do we need to do? And I'd like to suggest, we'll explore this if you like, we may need to do some things that our ancient ancestors, a couple of 100,000 years ago, didn't need to do. But one thing for sure, we and our ancestors, needed to survive. at the biological level in order to do anything else. So the question then becomes, how much reality do we need to be aware of in order to survive? And that takes us into the work of a brilliant cognitive scientist named Donald Hoffman. Donald Hoffman is another one of these guys that I just love. I just adore him. And you've seen my list is long because these people are amazing. Donald Hoffman has taken this question about as far as you can take. He has gone down rabbit holes and come back. I really love this guy. So he is proposing that our senses have evolved not to accurately represent reality, literally. They have evolved to help us stay in that sweet spot of survival by perceiving opportunities to, in fact, survive. What he calls fitness points. And let me just go into that. By virtue of the fact that evolution is doing what it's doing, please remember, evolution cares about one thing. It cares about survival. Surviving long enough to pass your genes on to the next generation, period. That's all it cares. It doesn't care about truth. It doesn't care whether you're happy or fulfilled. It doesn't care about anything other than who is fit enough, what is fit enough to survive. And that's the criterion that evolution is using to evolve our senses. And I look at that because our senses can't take in any more information or we would be overwhelmed and wouldn't survive. Any one of our ancestors who did is extinct. Any species who does is extinct. Takes in more reality than it needs to be aware of in order to survive. So that's like one of those points that you just go, whoa, wait a minute. But because Hoffman's brilliant in my mind, he gives us a beautiful analogy from our day-to-day life that really helps us get it at a deep level. And here's the analogy. When we open the lid on our laptop computer, just imagine we're now perceiving. We just opened our eyes. What do we see? We see not the reality of that computer at all. What we perceive is an interface that stands between us and the overwhelming reality of what that computer is. An absolutely incomprehensibly complex collection of electronic circuitry, gates that are sending signals through or not sending signals through, an almost infinitude of microcircuitry. You've got transistors, you've got impedances, all happening at the speed of light, utterly useless to us because it's overwhelming. What do we see? An interface. We see a desktop. Like a desktop. There it is, right there on the screen. Well, we can get a desktop, but that desktop doesn't exist. It does not exist, literally, in that computer. There's no desktop there. But by perceiving a desktop, we can begin to work with this computer. Because on that desktop that doesn't exist are more icons in the form of file folders, little blue icons with cute little tabs on them. There are no file folders on that computer. What they represent is an equally unfathomable amount of digital instructions that even overwhelm the people who write the code in terms of being able to conveniently, effectively work with the computer. They need that interface. It's literally standing between us and the reality of what that computer is. So we can work with that interface, and it is real to us. It's just not literally representing the reality of the computer.
Okay, so what I'm getting from this is that Donald Hoffman, legend in your eyes, basically outlined the fact that we see a convenient sort of iconography
Yes.
rather than what's actually there,
Yeah.
because it makes it simpler for us to navigate.
It is an algorithm that has compressed the unfathomably complex reality of a computer into something we can in fact use.
Yeah, so when I look at the computer and like I look at the desktop, it's so funny because talking about analogies, you know, we take something that we can understand
Yes.
and we stretch it onto something that we cannot to make it easier to navigate.
Dare I say, we project it back onto the reality of the computer and call it reality.
Yeah, and what's so funny is that so much of this is actually going to expire within a couple of generations because I've never had to use a mailbox,
Right.
right?
Right.
But like I'm sending mail all the time.
Right.
It's just, it's email. And,
Yes.
and I become so accustomed that I don't even see where when people were trying to introduce these computers to the mainstream,
Yes,
they had
snail.
to use these analogies to make it obvious to like
That's
why
right.
this could be useful.
That's right.
In terms of like, yeah, you can, instead of having to write down and
Yes.
send a piece of paper physically,
Yeah.
you can actually just send the you can send the information via a fiber optic cable.
Yes.
We'll call it email. So it's electric mail. We'll put some like iconography around it so
Of
people can
what?
understand it.
A little envelope.
Yeah, yeah, but
when's the last time you stuck something in an envelope
Like
and
never,
left it? Yeah.
never. And it's
Good.
like with all the files, even that. It's
Yes.
like, I don't know many people younger than me that have seen a filing cabinet. You
Right,
know, it's like
right.
those things have gone.
Right.
It's interesting because there's sort of like this residual aspect. There's this order effect where it's
Yes.
like it's not like we're gonna. The keyboard itself is a great example because you got QWERTY on the top, and QWERTY isn't actually a very good design of a keyboard.
No.
It's like the vowels are in the wrong place, but it was good when you were on a typewriter because then the things didn't hit each other as
That's
quickly.
right.
And so like now we have QWERTY on our keyboards, but it's not effective whatsoever.
What we call a legacy interface.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
we've now got this thing where we're pulling up a desktop and it's meant to look like a
Yeah.
desktop. Like I don't
Why
even
don't
think about
we
it.
have buggy whips as our icons? It just goes back farther. That iconography is going to change as this thing continues to, hear me, evolve. But here's the interesting part. That's the metaphor. Hoffman suggests that our user interface, remember, it's a metaphor, our user interface, our desktop, is space and time. Space and time, or as the physicists refer to it, space-time, because it's different aspects of the same weird phenomenon. 3 dimensions of space, length, width, depth, XYZ axis, and 1 dimension of time, moving inexorably in one direction, from past to present to future. What he's suggesting is that's nothing more than an interface to represent the unfathomable reality of what's actually there. Inconceivable what's actually there. So there's our interface. What do we put on the desktop? What do we put in this interface of space and time? Physical objects as icons. as representations of what's actually there that would overwhelm us and we wouldn't be able to survive. So you see, it's doing us a favor by doing this. Evolution, I'm speaking of. Those objects have characteristics that are totally dependent on that user interface, the context, the relative reality of that interface. They have position in space, in 3 dimensions. They can have movement, momentum, as we add that 4th dimension of time. That position is changing over time. Can have aspects like color, can have aspects like texture, aspects like sound, which is something we can get into because the perception of sound, not to throw a spoiler alert, there's no sound out there. They're just perturbances in some field, air, water. The sound is in here. It's the internal representation we're projecting out onto that slight disturbance or big disturbance in our immediate environment. So we've got this user interface. The key to this piece is we're not just making this stuff up. Those icons are important. You want to take those icons seriously, in some cases deadly seriously, just not literally. They're not literally what's there in that objective reality. What he's suggesting is, in terms of our survival, who the hell cares what's there in objective reality? What matters is what allows us to keep going, survive.
And I think just to illustrate this point, you're tapping on this table. It's not helpful at all if we were sort of hominids in the savannah to tap something that we believe to be solid and actually perceive, oh, there's so much empty space within this solid that my hand should actually fall right through, but it's actually magnetic repulsion on the surface.
How do you know? From perception or because you read that in a textbook someplace?
Read it in a textbook.
Yes.
But like it
happens to be true. But you're absolutely right. Does us no good to perceive it. It would actually harm us.
Yes, so this icon of a table that I have here is actually, this makes it far more easy to navigate the reality that's around me.
Yes.
Because it's just a very useful shortcut.
Yes.
Similarly to how the trash can on my computer is a very useful shortcut. It's not necessarily what's going on. There's a whole bunch of ones and zeros that are getting rid of a whole bunch of other ones and zeros, but it's a very sort of nifty shortcut to have there, but it's not what's really happening.
But do you want to take that trash can seriously?
Yeah, absolutely.
What happens if you drag that icon of the file folder to the trash?
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So take your icons seriously. If you're crossing a busy street and an icon of a fast-moving car comes, don't step in front of it because you don't have an undo command. In exactly the same way, don't drag your icon to the trash recklessly. Is there a little miniature trash can in your computer? It's not literally real. It's relatively real, and it is far more useful to you than the actual reality. Because by the time you figured out the coded instructions, the actual utility of that computer would be lost. We wouldn't be able to continue surviving with this tool that's nothing more than an extrapolation of a sharpened stick. It's another tool to help us survive. If we perceive that reality, the quantum reality, this subatomic reality, where in fact this table is mostly empty space. If that's what we perceived, let's go back a couple of 100,000 years. Our early ancestors who may have perceived that reality are all gone because they walked into walls. They were useless. Like, let's go attack this other group. Boom. Kevin over there keeps walking into trees because it's mostly empty space. The reality is, it is mostly empty space, but at the relative reality, the scale of the quantum level. That relative reality is very importantly part of a user interface. We're exploring, when we explore our physics, we're exploring the interface, not yet what's beyond the interface. I think we're ready to begin to explore what's beyond the interface, but we're going to have to really evolve to be better at handling the reality. Reminds me of an old Jack Nicholson movie, A Few Good Men. Jack Nicholson plays this hardened Marine officer, I think he's a general, and he's being questioned in a Navy court by a young, naive punk lawyer played by Tom Cruise. And Cruise gets that he's getting kind of pissed off at Cruise keep asking him these uncomfortable questions. And he says, "I'm sorry, General, we're just trying to get at the truth." And what Nicholson said applies here. He says, you want the truth? You can't handle the truth. We can't handle the truth. We can't handle literal reality. So what we've got is this interface. And it's going to continue to serve us until we evolve to either a more veridical, as they say, more true interface, or, perish the thought, the capacity to perceive reality as it actually is. See why when you ask this question, man, you're talking about a can of worms.
Oh, no, completely. And so just to again bring this back to my understanding of it so far, because I just want to make sure that I'm tracking well.
Sure.
And want to continue to just loop this into direct applicability.
Sure.
Right? I'm here trying to understand what it is that you are saying.
Yeah.
What you're doing is perturbing the air and perturbing an electromagnetic field. So I'm perceiving that as sound and, well, vision. And I'm projecting in my mind, cute little trick, projecting that as my experience, right? My conscious experience. Now, when we are talking about consciousness, it's the subjective experience of anything being anything, the quality of that. So this is my subjective experience of what you're saying.
Yeah.
And one of the things that comes with that subjective experience is a part of the trick is like, actually, that's the objective reality, where what you're describing is like, no, it's not. It can't be. We couldn't handle it if it was.
That's right.
And so as you're talking, I'm noticing how much more I'm not noticing because of basically the ability for my mind to conserve energy and only pay attention to what it is that it deems important, only ascribing meaning to the importance.
Important to what? This is brilliant.
Important to my current survival.
Yes.
Which in the way that my mind has abstracted that is my survival is no longer really tethered to physiological risk as much, but much more psychological risk.
Good for you.
And so my survival, it's still going right back to status, that conversation that we are a hominid species that really serves ranking. And it's important for my ranking at a survival level to listen to what it is that you're saying, right? And so I'm ascribing a load of meaning onto the projection of what you're saying and ignoring a bunch of other information because otherwise I'd be overwhelmed.
Exactly.
I remember there was one time when I was in your office and you said, like, when was the last time you noticed the nose on your face? And I was like,
It's right there.
yeah,
It's
but
sticking into your visual field. We just ignore it.
yeah, no, and mine's actually sticking a lot into my visual field, more so than most. But it's something that was so interesting is that like part of just perception is we edit out 99.999% of the information that we're perceiving.
Yes.
Not even and that's only a trickle of what's actually is there.
Yes. Yeah.
But what's so funny about just being human is that I edit out all of this information, and what I'm perceiving, it feels like I'm getting everything all of the time. It feels like I'm seeing, my peripheral vision,
Yes.
and I'm hearing everything that's
Yes.
going on. But in reality, I'm just editing out everything, and my conscious mind is just seeing this tiny little sort of highlight reel of
Because
just the information.
If you didn't edit it out, you would really have a survival disadvantage. You can get a hint of this when very intelligent people who are perceiving all the different ways they may say something actually impede their ability to speak, because they're hearing this partial sentence and then trying to correct it before they say it, and you get this weird kind of speaking that sounds like you're an idiot. You're actually brilliant. You're listening to 5 different conversations at the same time, trying to pick the best one. Which is more useful to your survival is the question Hoffman keeps coming back to. And as he relentlessly pursues this, the answers start becoming more and more clear. Survival advantage is what's driving our perception, not literal truth.
Okay, so when we were talking about belief, you mentioned that belief is an acceptance of something being true, whether or not we have the evidence to support it or not, right? And those beliefs are really just sort of convenient stories that we tell ourselves at a very deep level, right? Let's think of a good example. I believe in Santa Claus. I think that's the one that you actually used there.
Yeah.
So that belief is similar to what you're talking about, because it could be a useful fiction to believe in that, rather than actually knowing the entirety of everything that's going on. It might not be helpful to actually construct belief about the world that is reflective to be true. But actually, as you were mentioning with Donald Hoffman, if this is increasing my ability to survive long enough into the future to pass along my genes, then it's like, actually, that's the belief that's going to make it in and down the gene pool, rather than somebody that's seeing the whole truth for everything that it is.
Let's actually pursue that, because it's a very interesting proposal. Let's do a hypothetical. Let's say that in this case, survival means how well you fit in to your family's ethical and moral structure, as opposed to how well you don't fit into that. So you are a typically wired young kid, okay? You want what you want it now, and you don't want to share it. And your parents are busy telling you, look, you're going to have to learn that you can't just have everything you want right now, and you can't behave the way you've been behaving. You have been, dare I say, naughty. If you learn how not to be naughty, you're going to be rewarded. So suddenly, you're faced with this issue. But why should I stop being naughty? I got to get what I got to get. Here is this user interface. Here's this icon. Your example, Santa Claus. You believe in Santa Claus, you are going to delay your gratification in order to behave in a way that is ultimately going to help you survive. Then when you get old enough, good, we'll pull the rug out from under that. We'll update this user interface. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is if I'm a small child that's believing in Santa Claus, here's a convenient fiction to help me cooperate most likely with my siblings.
Yes.
Because at that stage of my development,
Yes.
my subjective experience is a lot more self-centered
Yes.
because my neurology hasn't developed to the point where it's like I need the tribe.
Yes.
It's more so like I'm the only thing in the world and I've got to optimize for me right now.
That's right.
Wow, wow, wow. Feed the baby.
That's right.
But having that develop and basically like here are a couple of tricks so that we can shortcut this child's behavior so that he's a little bit less obnoxious for, the next 3 years until he's old enough to kind of put the puzzle together and realize, well, Santa can't drop off, 8 billion presents around the world.
Look at the size of our chimney. Look at the, yeah.
Okay, that's really cool. So since in the past few hundred years, the scientific method has introduced falsifiability. It's basically like, here's a claim, here's a hypothesis.
Yes.
Can we put that out into the objective reality rather than the convenient reality, the relative reality that we're sort of perceiving?
Yes.
We put out a hypothesis into the objective reality and see if our biases and our heuristics are off base. And we basically, if we put our chips on the objective reality, if it comes in different to our perception, then we can do sort of miraculous things. For example, like, Galileo dropping balls off the Leaning Tower of Pisa was a big boom because it's like you would think that bigger, heavier objects fall quicker. And that's just a really convenient heuristic for us. We don't need to know the difference because, hundreds of thousands of years ago, who cares if it's falling, it's going to hurt.
Exactly right.
Get out the way.
Yeah.
You have somebody that's putting forth a hypothesis, dropping things off of a tower that isn't quite built straight, and showing everybody that actually it doesn't matter the sort of the size or the weight, it will fall at the same time.
Yeah.
And so you have an example like that, and you start to use that information, and you can make more accurate predictions about how these icons might behave in reality.
Yes.
My waffly question here is, do you think that there is, maybe it's too loaded of a question, I've really led the witness to a to a conclusion, but I'm still interested to hear what you have to say.
Don't be too surprised because there's a lot to what you're saying.
Do you think that there's more benefit to perceiving the true objective reality rather than just perceiving our perceptions and thinking that that's the cat's pajamas?
Great. So let me ask you to look at what evolution has led us to. Because that is the sole criterion that we're talking about. What gives us fitness points to keep surviving? And notice what you've done. You've said we're going to put this theory out there into objective reality and we're going to test it. I'd like to suggest you've done no such thing, and neither did Galileo. Within this user interface, he did that, but he just climbed to the top of an icon and dropped 2 different sized icons off onto the icon. No, I'm serious.
I know you're serious.
And that's the thing. It served us to have him do that and to believe that, whoa, because the relative reality expanded, but within the context of this user interface of space and time. We may now be at a place where we're ready to deal with a universe that doesn't even have space and time as its fundamental matrix. We may not. If not, trust me, no one's going to pay any attention to the mutation that is going to be tested for survivability. And if it doesn't pass the test, this whole concept will just die. I'm suggesting this concept isn't going to die because ultimately it's going to give us more survival capacity from this point forward. We're at a very important juncture in our evolution.
Okay, before we get to the future, because I've got a lot of questions there to ask, with the example of Galileo, right? That was met with a lot of friction, especially in the Italian world, that ultimately ended in his house arrest, right?
Why?
Because it went against the grain of the Orthodox Church at the time.
What? Dropping things off of the...
No, some
Good.
of the implications that he was going after with basically building off of Copernicus and that we're not the center of the universe.
Yes.
And that went against sort of some of the dogma of the day,
Yes.
being, you know, well, we're created in God's image and we are the center of the universe and, you know, everything revolves around us, et cetera, et cetera.
And that doesn't stop easily. Do you know when that was formally reversed, by the way?
Oh, I bet it was like 1968.
1970 something. Oh my God. It's like, oh, you know, okay, Galileo was right. We're not the center of the universe. The Earth, in fact, goes around the sun. It's like, really?
Okay. No,
You're actually coming out with a statement like that? Yes.
So there's that lag period with the church, but like with just survivability in general.
Yeah.
If we think about the implications of what just the scientific method was able to do in
Yes.
terms of like this reality testing,
Yes.
right? And the falsifiability and the doubt,
Yes.
like that was really the meat, is like doubting our perceptions.
Yes.
And then doing a bunch of these little tests with all of these icons to see if we can actually create better sort of technologies from it.
Yeah. And getting people all over the place, whether they agree or not, to participate. That's really brilliant.
Yes, and I think that if we take it to the survivability aspect, where it's, you know, there's a lot of resistance with the dogma and the doctrine of the day.
Sure.
Right? But if we then think about the implications, it's like evolution is pushing at the tribal level, is pushing that forwards.
Yes.
Because if you think about what the scientific revolution did in junction with the industrial revolution, was, you know, humans were able to really take over the world and enhance status all over the place.
Yes.
Right? And that's, we don't need to go into, you know, empire building and all of that stuff.
But it would be helpful if we did, because my question is, what is the biggest existential threat to our survival?
Oh, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Us.
So don't be too fooled by thinking we're all that and look at what we've accomplished. We can survive. Oops. Evolution hasn't stopped with us. That's another one of these weird perceptions of being so self-referential that you think, yeah, we're the apex of evolution. We're a small brick in a wall that goes on for eternity. We may be on our way to exterminating ourselves.
Okay. Just before we get to the future part, because that's I do want to dig in here. It seems as if one thing that evolution does is it acts upon the lineage and it acts upon multiple levels at the same time.
Brilliant.
Right?
Yes.
Because if we think about an ant colony, you have a bunch of individual ants that work together and support a higher level of a system, which is a colony.
Yes.
And there's an emergent sort of property that comes with the colony,
Yes.
right? And so if
It
we
emerges.
Yeah.
Make that clear to people because you're right on.
and so you've got all of these ants working together as individuals, and then you get this emergent property of the colony.
Yeah.
Right? Evolution isn't necessarily working at the individual ant level,
Not at all.
and it isn't necessarily working at the cells of that individual ant. It's working at sort of all of the levels, whether that be the cells in the ant's foot, the ant itself, or the colony.
Yeah.
But most importantly, the colony stabilizes the most amount of things. So if we then stretch that as an analogy to humans, and we've got Italy, right? And you've
Right.
got Galileo's idea of, maybe, well, there's multiple ideas, but like just the support of the scientific method. It's like, well, actually, survivability here is science and industry and all of these sort of incredibly exciting technologies have an ability to secure our survivability into the future. So, evolution's working at all of these different levels
Yes.
at the same time.
Yes.
And is not necessarily taking us to a beautiful, wonderful, great place, because, there's some pretty dark stuff that comes along with surviving.
What is it that is surviving? Again,
tribe.
take off your anthropocentric goggles. What is it that's surviving? Do you think Darwinian evolution stops at species? Darwinian evolution is universal evolution. Ideas, theories, technologies, they're all evolving. If they work at that deep level, they survive. If they don't, they don't. How catchy is a jingle on some advertisement? That's evolution at work. How attractive to a pollinating insect is the fragrance of a flower? Because without that pollination, it can't survive. We think of it as us, we're surviving, or we're not surviving. The universe is evolving. It's not just us. It's not even just species of animals. It's everything. Everything's evolving. This Darwinian theory is massive. And it's deep, and it can be almost terrifying when you look at the scope of it, the relative reality of it.
Well, terrifying, because if we dig into that, it feels like I'm falling. I don't have a sense of control, right? And
Beautiful.
so it's like, oh my God, I'm scared, because firstly, I mean, if we just sort of go back and just sort of check up on the episodes that have gone by so far,
Yes.
it's like, I don't have an ability, firstly, to perceive reality.
Yes.
I can't control anything that's going on within it. I have a bunch of beliefs that are sort of hardwired, and then I update with my software that might not actually fit what's going on. It might just be like good enough, I'm obsessed with status, and that's sort of like driving so much of my behavior that I don't even see, because it's like not convenient and might be distasteful if I'm actually perceiving it.
And you might even be so obsessed with status, as you put it, that you're too busy to reproduce, and all of your genetic material stops with you and your pursuit of status. That's evolution at work. It's a values hierarchy. I hate to come back to what we're talking about.
Well, also, if we think about this just from the tribal level,
Yeah.
that could actually be a significantly good strategy for evolution to be acting upon, in terms of, but we see this from the tribe. If certain members of the tribe don't reproduce, if certain members of the tribe instead are trying to lift their own status personally, and as a result of it, the rising tide lifts all boats, right? If our tribe, if somebody's so obsessed with like getting the biggest teepee. There's going to be other resources that benefit around it in
Yes.
the other humans in orbit. So it could actually be a good strategy to just maximize for status,
Yeah.
knowing that has sort of a radiant effect within the people that are cooperating around.
Yeah. And that specifically, the individual may not have to reproduce in order to keep those genes going based on that individual's relationship to whomever it is he or she is helping.
Yeah.
That's the other piece about Darwinian evolution. It isn't just I have to survive. If my fraternal or my close relatives survive, those genes, a lot of the same genes, get passed along. Selective altruism.
I mean, let's look at the ants again. The ants will just go and sacrifice themselves in sort of troves to protect the queen.
What do you think the individual ant's reality, what do you think the individual ant's user interface is? I'm suggesting you can't even conceive of it.
Couldn't even get close.
But there is one.
Yeah, right back to the consciousness conversation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And is that a better strategy? Because if it is, let's look at the Chinese model. The modern Chinese model as opposed to the Western model of individuality. Which model works? This is evolution at work. You want to be a hotshot individual? Is that what's driving your culture? And more importantly, do you want to be amused? Do you want to be distracted? Do you want to have a good time? Do you not want to really work all that hard? Or do you want to be industrious? Do you want to the point where your young people are committing suicide? Because there is no fun. Everybody's working so hard to achieve the thing. All right, these things are warring strategies. Darwin's flipping around in his grave going, man, I didn't even think of that one. Shit.
Okay, so Jim, we've got a bunch of technologies that are about to really, I think they've already hit the exponential curve in terms of how they've developed. It's just there's like this lag period for us actually feeling the effects.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking in particular to like artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that being said, do you think that an artificial intelligence is perceiving its own reality, right? I don't know how it perceives. I don't think I can fathom the amount of data that it's sort of computing, but there's a reality that it's perceiving that might be able to help us get closer to a truth. Do you think, just looking forwards, that these technologies that we're starting to use as a species are going to be helpful for our survival? Or do you think that knowing what we're like, we will try and do something or make some silly mistake and maximize for, the survivability of too small of a group at the expense of the population or a planet?
Yeah.
What are your sort of thoughts on how an enhanced perception of different realities, I'm saying that from the relative sense,
Sure.
with technologies sort of enhancing our ability to perceive and understand the world. Do you think that that's a recipe for net good or net bad?
Well, that's the question of the hour, really, because there's now whole fields of, I'll just generally call them technological ethics. Like, how should we use this stuff? It's obviously going to be generated. How do we use it? Just the fact that that exists and that everyone involved isn't scurrying around trying to figure out how to get their own individual survival advantage is a great sign. At least somebody is thinking about what's best for the overall. So remember that what we're doing is just creating more and more tools. It must have been a staggering piece of technology the first time some hominid picked up a jawbone and hit another one in the head. It's like, what was that? So really, if we can just look at it that generally, getting this much more data is clearly on this exponential curve. Might be even what they call asymptotal curve. So the question is increased data increased wisdom? So let's think of wisdom as how effectively do we work with this information? And what's driving it? What is the values hierarchy behind it? That's what I'm more interested in than any particular new technology. Because what we do with this additional knowledge, this additional information, is what counts. So how do we best frame this onslaught of additional information? That's the question. How do you even frame what this AI is going to enable us to do? It's already making people less likely to think things through. I know too many people whose first move is go to ChatGPT and have ChatGPT do this for me. They're actually downgrading their ability to think things through. I'm seeing it everywhere. I'm saying that may or may not be a good thing, because it doesn't have to be black and white. It doesn't mean don't use the technology, but is it your first go-to rather than I'm going to try to think this through myself? Who knows what the best strategy is? Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And a little triggering because my go-to is ChatGPT.
That's okay. It's all right. You're probably right. You know, don't forget, I'm advocating buggy whips as far as this culture is concerned.
Well, I think that there's a caution that I tend to take when using ChatGPT. For like, when I do it, it gives me a good first step, but I never take that as to be I don't trust it that much. And I think that I'm in a minority there because there's blind faith that's applied to a lot of this kind of stuff. But there's been times when it's given me the wrong answer. And that's something where, again, if we understand how it's working, it's predicting the next word that comes up to a really great degree. It's like, it's going to get that wrong. And it depends on the data set that it's trained on, right? And so that's something that's people need to take real consideration over. And you're right, there are these sort of ethical committees that are like, how do we use this technology? However, what I am fearful of is if you mentioned that, like, what are the values that are driving a lot of the development here?
Yeah.
And it's what, January 21st, 2022? Just because there's a lag time for the viewers. So yesterday there was, and the day before, there was the ban of TikTok and then the re-implementation of TikTok. Now let's just look at this for what it is, right?
Yeah.
You've got a social media platform that you mentioned China before that is Chinese. And so they have the ability to read all of this data.
Yes.
Now what this data is how people, especially in the States, but all over the world, and I'm saying especially in the States because I have a bias to myself and I'm in America,
Sure.
How they interact with movies, short little films. And that seems kind of benign and harmless. However, every swipe tells a story, every click is read by the machine, and that machine then has a better ability to predict what you're going to want to engage with. And what it's doing is taking more and more of your attention away from you, right? And the strength there is that if it has a really good way of taking your attention away from you, then TikTok can then sell that attention to somebody that wants to use the platform or promote their own products. And so what's scary here is that if the Chinese have all of that data, they have an ability to not only understand who you are and what you like to consume, but if there was another sort of agenda that they wanted to promote, there could be a risk there. And I'm saying there could be because, like, right now, what's provoked in me is this us-them mentality where it's like tribe versus tribe. You don't want them having all of that because they might manipulate it. And that
As
creates...
opposed to we, who wouldn't, of course.
Oh, of course not. We would never do something like that. But there's this escalation where it's like, well, you know, I trust the guys in Silicon Valley more than I trust the ones in, I don't know if there's an equivalent in China, but it's like I trust my data there more than there. And so there's this fear that comes with it because it's like, what's scary is that what I'm paying attention to is my reality, right? Because that is what I'm projecting. This is what I understand. And more I'm spending more and more of my time looking at these screens, and that's my reality, right? And if someone or some other entity has a better way of basically feeding me information that gets me looking at that screen more and more and consuming more and more, then it's changing the way that I behave. It's changing the way that I see. And so that's what just frightens me, because we look at the values and ultimately if we again go from the ant level to the colony level, we got two big colonies that are in an arms race with each other over data because of how valuable that data is in terms of how it can be manipulated, especially by these new intelligences, intelligii, that are coming out that can basically be used for malintent. And so the thing that scares me the most is it's that we better do it before they type mentality. And that's like, you can't escape that trap within the system unless you sort of let go, but you don't want to let go at this point. So anyway, that was a long waffly way of saying, Jim, I'm scared. What do you think?
So first of all, let's look at our relative realities and the term malintent. Because from your hypothetical Chinese perspective, this isn't malintent. We're just trying to survive. Because those Westerners are busy doing the same thing to us. And if we don't do it first, if we don't go deeper than they go, then we won't survive. So, first of all, pay attention to relative realities. There is no malintent or good intent without relativity of some kind. Relative to what or whom? So there's our first piece. Second, how new do you think this phenomenon is?
Not very.
It's not very new at all. There have been species since the beginning of the Darwinian map who've been hacking other species' user interfaces. There are species of moths that have evolved to have designs on their wings that look just like great big open eyes, right down to the highlights. They're hacking the user interface of predatory birds who would otherwise eat them. These birds look at this thing, they see real eyes. They're much bigger than the eyes of the particular moth. And the bird goes, whoa, big eyes like that means there's a big creature. I'm not going to go near that. And they fly away. There's this arms race that's been going on forever. That's what evolution is. It's a competition between strategies. But more specific to what you're talking about, how much control do you want to have over this process? It doesn't matter that you're scared. The question is, how scared? Scared enough to do something about it or not? Remember, in our values discussion, I don't care what somebody wants. What they say they want, I could care less. The only thing that matters is how much do you want it? Enough to do something about it. Enough to shut the lid on your desktop long enough to quiet all this down. To quiet all these internal representations down. To calm the emotional response to those internal representations, to relax your body so it's not all contracted as a response to these internal representations, enough to quiet your mind so that after a period of time, you come back to that interface with a completely different view of it. And I'm suggesting that is one way to keep yourself from being distracted, led around by the nose by somebody who's hacking your user interface. But you have to be willing to do that. You have to be concerned enough to do something different than you're doing right now. Because brains far greater than yours and mine are working day and night to make sure you don't do that. They're being incentivized by profit and national interest.
Well, you took it to the stillness place, and I was trying to think of a nice bridge to get there.
Well, I'm biased. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I am so grateful to stillness, I can't put it into words. So it's not mine, by the way. Stillness is a state of awareness that was handed to me. It's a gift.
And one thing to make very clear here is that I just want anybody who's listening that stillness, it is a practice, right? It is a way to train your mind to get into a state.
Getting still is.
Yes.
The state is what stillness is. It's not a specific technique or series. Whatever we can do to get still, we do. We're presenting techniques to facilitate that, make it easier.
Well, I just want to make a real distinction here because that state is something that when I think just in the common lexicon, people think of stillness and they think of, Ryan Holiday, stillness is the key, right? But I think we're talking about something much different. Mm-hmm. And I think we're talking about a much deeper state of what someone would refer to as meditation.
We are.
Right? It's a much deeper meditative state.
Yes.
And that's what I want to make really clear, because when we're talking about just quieting it down and all of that stuff, it's like, no, you've put together a pretty rigorous toolkit of techniques to really get that mind quiet and really get into that depth of meditation, rather than just I'm letting my thoughts settle and then I'm on to the next thing.
Right.
I just want to make that really clear. When we're talking about stillness, it's like, no, you think more like, a Zen Buddhist having done however many decades of training, then saying here's a bunch of techniques to drop into that real depth of non-duality. Yeah. It's that's what we mean when we say stillness, right? Not just, I'm being mindful.
But we've got our version of that. We call the other thing stillishness, better than not being still at all, but it's not quite still.
Yeah. Well, I just want to make that really clear.
But thank you, because I need to be reminded of that.
And there are a series of techniques to get there. It's not like, well, now at this point, having put in probably a good 8 years of training, it's like I can still my mind without the techniques.
Yeah.
But you need to get to the other side of the river and you need the boat to get there.
Yeah.
Right? And so I just want to make that really clear, that when you say stepping away from closing the desktop and stepping away and actually doing something about it, I just want to make clear that that something isn't just thinking about something else for a couple of minutes and then patting yourself on the back for doing that. And what I want to get to with the discipline is that if we go back to the question that I asked you, it's I'm scared. What do I do about it? Jim, fix my problems.
Sure.
It's that fear is manipulating my reality.
It is.
That state of mind is changing what I perceive.
Because it's not just your mind, it's your body as well.
Everything. And that state, from an evolutionary perspective is incredibly important to have, because I'm more alert, I'm less sort of pensive, and being sort of more paranoid in the savannah and looking at everything and having this bias towards negativity is incredibly helpful for our survival.
Yes.
Right? So let's just lay that groundwork, because we already have. Just go back to it and hit that touchstone.
Yeah.
But this state of mind it's dictating my behaviors similarly. And what you're talking about is getting still, changing my state of mind, touching this kind of mother state, which is no perception of stories in my head, no past, no future, just a complete observation of the present moment in front of me. And just that four-dimensional, that fourth dimension of, time, it's like just perceiving now for exactly what it is. Doing so stops all of the inertia of my previous states of mind that are biasing my decision making, right? The only reason I know all of this is because going to that place in stillness gives me the ability to see how these states are constructed within myself.
Good for
right?
you.
And that's like incredible.
That's the purpose of any form of meditation, by the way, that has any legs at all. To be able to actually observe your own mind. That's all.
And it's such a beautiful thing,
Yeah.
because when asking the question, I felt like a dunce, because as you're giving this sort of very articulate answer, it's like, well, of course, the one thing that you can do is step back within yourself and observe what's going on.
Yes.
And then back to the control aspect, it's like, what's in your control? Are you going to try and control China, Henry?
Right.
Because I don't think that's going to work very well.
Yeah.
But what you can control is your state.
Yes.
You can control your attitude. You
Yes.
can control your will. You can
Yes.
control your intent.
Yes.
Those things are there.
Yes.
Right? And having that helps you to understand, well, it's like, if I can control these three things, I don't necessarily need to keep sitting in fear.
Right.
That might not be helpful.
Right.
What could be helpful at this point in time?
Yeah.
It's like, maybe not giving TikTok all of my information, maybe just being like a little
Good
bit
for
more
you.
sort of cautious, and also making decisions that make decisions for me, knowing
Yes.
how incredibly well designed these technologies are
Yes.
to keep getting my attention.
Yes.
Maybe it's like, can I put in self-binding techniques that stop me from
Good for
doing
you.
that stuff?
If you want to. But the question is, who are you really, and what do you really want? Because that is going to come out through your behavior. So watch your behavior. You can answer that question, and then again, in stillness, say, wow, that's what I really want, because this is what I'm doing. I never realized that I really want to sit there for 2.5, 3 hours and being utterly distracted by a scrolling roll of toilet paper. I never intended that, but here I am doing it. Now I know something about myself in reality that I didn't know before. Good. What, if anything, would I like to do about that? That's where it's your choice. I'm not saying there's some objective right or wrong thing to do. The question is, how much reality do you need to be aware of in order to do what you want to do, what you need to do? What do you need to do? Because you can spend a lifetime scrolling. That's quite literally what these people want you to do. They're profiting by that. It's not to get you to buy stuff. You are the product. Just stay engaged. That's all. We got you. Or do we? So that's where stillness leads to an examination of your values. What do you really want? Have you given it any thought? Or are you just reactive to what's happening? This then leads to an expansion of your sense of self. Then you're living a life, and you're doing so more and more consciously. That's all practical spirituality is. Live your life. But do it consciously and do it to the best of your ability, every split second.
I've got a childish question.
No such thing.
You should probably wait to hear the question before saying that. Before asking my childish question, I had another sort of series of light bulbs just go off.
Yeah.
And if we think about our conversation on spirit,
Yeah.
spirit being our essence, right? The way that I like to think about it, you spent a long time in that episode talking about how analogous our minds are.
Yeah.
The analogy that I like to use is you basically have, imagine this cup and my spirit is the tea. The tea fills the cup and I assume that I'm the cup, right? And the spirit is my essence.
Yeah.
What you mentioned before is that, like, of course, at some level, there is a field that's all connected, and it's just very convenient to create a reality around this cup to think that it's separate and that it's special and that it's different, right? The experience of the spirit within this cup is my consciousness, right? And what you're talking about in terms of practical spirituality is taking a step back more and more to just observe the liquid within the vessel, to then understand the nuances of the vessel, and from that understanding, then be able to create more conscious, or at least try to have more conscious decision making over basically what's going on there.
Yeah.
Is that a decent summary?
Sure.
Or are there a couple of adjustments that you can make to, I don't know, make that analogy more fluid for people listening?
No, it's a good analogy, because remember what our skill here is. Our goal is to develop the skill to navigate these different scales. At the level you're talking about, it's very, very useful to think in terms of a cup and the tea in the cup. But it has limits. If you expand the scope, you increase the scale, you're now getting more information. It's a broader sense of yourself, a broader sense of what is. It's relative. There isn't one particular scale. The job is to navigate, to be able to go from micro to macro.
Sounds a bit like focus.
It's exactly what it is, because at the micro, there is the drama of being in it. That's why we're here. At the macro, there is the peace of being utterly unified, one with everything, and everything in between. You conceive of something up here in the more macro, but things get done at the more micro. If you're stuck in one or the other, you're only limited. If you have the ability to navigate, problems at the level of a problem can actually stop being problems altogether, let alone being able to find solutions by expanding your scope. That's all.
Okay, so I want to ask my childish question building off of my analogy. And my childish question goes to your experience with stillness in general. And so if I fill my gym mug with gym tea, and every morning Jim gets still for a long period of time, and I'm projecting onto what I believe your experience to be, and I'm very excited to hear your thoughts and your corrections, but it's kind of like when you're getting still, pouring the gym tea back into the ocean of isness, right? When you're still, you're not the vessel, and you drop into just what is, right? And that is a much different perception of reality. You are perceiving things in a different way, right? And at first, I think one of the most practical things about a meditative experience is what we were talking about earlier, just that distance. You're just being able to observe the user interface.
Yeah.
You're able to see
See it
the
for what it is.
iconography on the desktop.
Yep.
You're like, oh, cool. You know, there's the trash can, right? I want to talk about more of like what has a depth of this practice over decades done to your perception of reality? Because I know just from my meager experiences with stillness, it gets more and more sort of wacky and loopy. The more that you expand that scope of context, the more that you just pour the tea back into the tea pool. I don't know, important it
No,
into.
that's right.
What is it like? What is your reality like today? In both, like, I think that everybody can sort of empathize and create an analogy with, like, right now you're sort of conscious and you're listening and focused, right?
Sure.
Like, everybody kind of has that experience. And so it's like, great, I don't really care to know what that's like.
Sure.
What I want to know is, like, how has your perception of reality shifted, especially when you go into these deep, deep, deep states of stillness? And what has that meant for your life when you come back?
It's a great question. And let me just say, again, this is my perception, but even that word will take on some interesting, questionable reality. So I'd like to suggest that in stillness, real deep stillness, you shut the lid on the user interface. You stop creating internal representations. Okay? Things quiet down. As things quiet down, those internal representations aren't being replaced with new ones. Your body relaxes. Its response to those internal representations just relaxes. There's no more tension. Your emotional response to those internal representations, remember that's all we're perceiving, calms down. Your mind becomes quiet, clear, and still. And as this continues to quiet down, all of this reaches a point where you're no longer generating this stuff. I'd like to suggest that in true, deep stillness, reality begins to present itself. Because it's always been presenting itself. The question is, how much reality do we need to be aware of in order to do what we need to do? I need to become whole and complete. So in order to do that, I need to quiet all of this stuff down. The user interface quiets. This reality is presenting itself not in the icons of the user interface anymore. Don't bother looking for that. Don't bother listening for that. You're not listening, you're projecting. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. In that state, no internal representations of that reality, no icons, no thoughts, no concepts, no representations at all. What I can only call a very gentle, very peaceful knowing, awareness. What Lao Tzu calls the Tao. Admittedly, for lack of a better term, the path, the way of no way. He's saying, I can't call it anything else. I don't even know what to call it. Ironically, right after he finished saying the Tao that can be spoken of, that can be represented, is not the true Tao. So representing it is a joke. You can't. And how could it be represented? How could it be defined? It's infinite. And as that Tao reveals itself to you in abject stillness, this tiny last bit of information, this digital information, I am separate. I'm apart from everyone and everything else. Not a part of it, I'm apart from it. I'm here having my objective. I'm objectifying everything. I'm making objects, icons out of everything, including myself. That last little bit of information, that last digital bit, just quietly clicks from 1 to 0. And you're no longer perceiving, you're no longer generating internal representations that you're looking at, listening at. Perception is replaced by being. I am reality. I am it. It is. No more discussion, no more representation, no separation. There is no language around that. Language is just standing in the way, and it just, and it is the most gentle, the most peaceful, the most full I've ever felt. And the gift is, I get that any time I want it now. I had to go live on a mountain to find it. And all I ever wanted to do was just share that with people because it's such a gift. And I kind of can't. Because that means someone would have to be having this relative reality to even think that's important. So my sort of quixotic fool's errand is, can you try to do? I'm not sure anybody wants to anymore. I thought, again from that weird myopic place, who wouldn't want this? My God, it's the end of all you're seeking. All the things you're trying to get, you have now. The most macro position there is. And the ability to then come back into these micro scales and live a better life. That's priceless. But in order to share it, you have to represent it in iconic terms in this user interface. It doesn't fit any more than a discussion of color fits in a user interface of black and white. It's just gibberish. What are you talking about? You have to expand and get into that expanded space to even understand what color is. So I don't know if that makes any sense or if I'm just ranting, but this is what stillness is. It's not some guru monk magic trick so you can do kung fu better. It's the end to all the things that plague human beings. It's reality in its wholeness, completeness, not in its subjective versus objective duality. It's integration, resolution, wholeness. And it's an utter awareness of who and what you truly are. Awareness. Not aware of anything, just awareness. The most peaceful thing I can't even begin to describe it. It would be silly. After that, the capacity to understand what Lao Tzu meant when he said the Tao, I just took 10 copies of that book, that little tiny book, and just started reading every translation of it I could find because that guy got it. So I hope I haven't just bored you to sleep.
Quite the opposite. Thank you.
Thank you.
Because I did give you a very childish question.
That's not childish, it's childlike.
Well,
It's the gift of gifts.
it became clear to me when you were answering the question that my motive for asking it was to have you give some type of peak experience reflection so that there could be an ability to attract more attention on the internet to get more people to listen to what this experience could be. Because if you're saying like, oh my God, it's like, it feels like the butterfly opening up on the nose of a stag right in front of you in the middle of this, like, and just gone on this complete sort of,
It's a morgasm.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Then it's like, oh, great, that's going to be wonderful because then we can use that footage to get more attention on the internet. The same thing that I was actually talking about being scared of earlier.
Yes.
Something with more hooks and something that's stickier, and like
It's
so that we can get more
ubiquitous.
views, right?
It's everywhere, Henry.
Oh God, and it's so interesting because what you were talking about is far from a peak experience. No. Right? It's just experience in its raw elemental form.
It's the absolute valley experience. It's what water seeks. The lowest possible place.
And what was so beautiful about that is that I know that you're probably not familiar with some of these terms. For example, shunyata, does that mean anything to you?
No.
Okay, it's a Buddhist term about emptiness. And when you're talking about this, what clicked for me is that here you have somebody else that's having the same human experience that you're describing in terms of dropping into whatever this is, and then coming back and using parallel analogies to try and communicate these mini stories to help the people around them understand that this is within them and that they can access that. And it's so interesting because you're talking about this dissolving of the borders of all of the iconography. And in Buddhism, they talk about emptiness is form and form is emptiness, right? And there's this whole sort of paradoxical aspect where you look at something for long enough, and that can be chopsticks if you want. You study something for long enough and the borders dissolve and you feel the oneness that's underneath everything, right? Yes. And so what was just really interesting about what you were talking about is that people on the other side of the planet thousands of years ago have used different words to describe the same experience. And that experience is the subjective experience of a reality, right? So it seems as if what you're describing is actually more aligned with the objective reality. If multiple people can then describe the same thing in different ways, because you're talking about Lao Tzu and he's saying the same bloody thing, and you're saying this guy got it, and it's like, wow, let's go back to the consciousness aspect. Really sticky, right? We accept the given reality of Homo sapien and monkey, and we forget that we are just the liquid that's within it. You do a couple of techniques and you do it for long enough, you can find the gaps in the armor and you can slip into what it is to actually be the liquid rather than the vessel.
But you have to break the habit of then jumping right back out and saying, notice what just happened. That's objectifying it. You are that liquid. Don't pop it back out and say, oh, that was a cool experience. I wonder when the next cool experience is going to be. You just failed. You just fell back out again. That's all Lao Tzu is doing. And he's just frustrated as hell because he has to talk about it. According to legend, because no one really knows much about Lao Tzu, he may be like Shakespeare. He may not be an actual person. According to legend, He was on his way out to the wilderness because he was fed up with where the culture where he lived was going. And the guard at the frontier stops him and says, look, before you go, I'm paraphrasing obviously, would you do me a favor and just write something down because you're all that, you get it. And he says, all right. And he writes this tiny little thing, which you can read cover to cover and then repeat for the rest of your life, and you'll still be, whoa. So there is that reality underneath it, but don't be fooled by the words. Don't be fooled by my words. My words are just so paltry, so pathetically trying to describe the indescribable. Full circle, you've asked me to define the indefinable, to make the infinite finite. That's what it is to be a human being.
I mean, Buddha even said it himself, where it's like, find out for yourself.
Yeah.
And
God love him for that too.
It's difficult to describe the indescribable. I think you've done a pretty damn good job. You've shifted what I conceive of as reality and given me the instrumentation within myself to continue to shift that reality throughout my life,
good.
you know? And that right there is, I think, a job well done in terms of you wanting to share this, because I hear you loud and clear, and it's fundamentally bettered my life. And I think that's the reason that I sort of contort you into these conversations that I know you probably don't want to be having, you don't want to be thinking about, you don't want to be doing all of this, because you'd rather just be being. You know, that's something that I carry with me too, but I think that it's important to squeeze this information out of you so that other people can hopefully get some of the stuff that you're talking about.
That's very sweet. Well, I'm not going to lie. I'm actually looking forward to going back and just being myself, getting still, just going farther and farther in, because I don't belong on the internet. I really don't.
Yeah, no, I kind of feel like that God. It's like, hey, before you go out, can you write some shit down? But instead of writing it down, it's like, we got 3 cameras, you got a few months. It's like, I'm gonna ask you the hardest questions in the world, see how you fare with them, and then share them with as many people.
God love you, Henry, because you really have done a great job of treading some really tricky territory here. You're totally in it, but you're not necessarily of it, at least not all the time. And you know the difference. And in today's world, that's graduate level stuff. So I love you for that. I will never stop loving you for that. And to the extent that this helps anybody, I'm thrilled. But like I said, I'm really looking forward to going back in.
Well,
anonymously.
Before you do that, we've got fear, ego, failure, and love, I believe. And not small topics.
Oof.
But I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about all of them. And then I promise I will let you go. And I will thank you then. I will thank you now. And I want you to know that I love you too. I always will. I have for a long time. But again, similar to reality, you shifted the way that I even perceive love as a state of being.
Good.
So
good.
I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves because we've got some episodes to go before then.
Sure.
But thank you again, Mr. George, for everything that you shared today.
Thank you. And thank you. Thank you for being here, for caring enough to watch, because you may well be the leading, dare I call it, bleeding edge of evolution. Don't discount that possibility. Thank you.
So, as always, thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. Now, if you're looking to build a stillness practice yourself, we have a lot of free resources, audios that Jim's recorded, etc., and you can see those in our show notes below. Along with that, there are also online courses that you can roll in if you want to learn more from Jim. We also have Obsidian mind maps. You can see a couple of them popping up here on the screen. Now, these are really cool ways to look at the podcast information and really just get an overview of all of the podcast topics and deepen the information within yourself. And within them, there are more of Jim's recordings. There's also a lot of Jim's artwork. So if you're interested in any more still life stuff, you can find a bunch of links in the description below. Finally, I really hope that you're getting as much out of this as I have. This is why we started this whole thing in the first place, because the combination of Jim and the practice of stillness had really helped to transform our lives here at Still Life. We just wanted to make as much of that available to you. So hopefully you're getting a lot out of it, and please let us know if there's anything that you want to see more of in the future, or less of. Anyway, hope you have a lovely day. Bye-bye.